I want you to know that this administration is motivated by a political philosophy that sees the greatness of America in you, her people, and in your families, churches, neighborhoods, communities, the institutions that foster and nourish values like concern for others and respect for the rule of law under God. Now, I don't have to tell you that this puts us in opposition to, or at least out of step with, a prevailing attitude of many who have turned to a modern-day secularism, discarding the tried and time-tested values upon which our very civilization is based.
Hey historians! You just heard President Ronald Reagan describe the conflicting cultural values that divided many Americans in the 1980s. Reagan described how secular or non-religious values conflicted with his more traditional views of America. As we've learned, the decades following World War II brought significant changes and challenges to American society. By the 80s, these changes caused many people to question the values that a good American should uphold. As people across the nation responded to this question in different ways, it became clear that there was no agreed-upon American identity. By the 80s, this led to a culture war, a struggle between two sets of conflicting cultural values. You might have heard this phrase before. It certainly pops up from time to time, particularly in politics. Many people believe that the culture war of the 1980s is still happening today. But how did the culture war begin? Who's fighting it, and how? And what are they fighting for? Let's find out. Let's begin by looking at some familiar images from the decades leading up to the 1980s, so we can understand the roots of the culture wars. Check out these images from the 1960s and head to your PDF to look closer at them. Some of these images show the social norms of the era, and others show how some people challenged that status quo. Think back to what you've already learned about the culture and counterculture of the 1960s. Which of these images do you think represents the mainstream values of the decade? If you guessed these, you're right. In the 1960s, most Americans valued conformity, patriotism, and traditional family structures and gender roles. These images, however, represented the counterculture, which introduced a new set of values based on nonconformity, peace, and individualism, values that directly opposed mainstream society. Now, let's check out these images from the 1970s. Throughout the decade, many Americans continued to challenge the existing social order. The Civil Rights Movement, the Women's Liberation Movement, and the Gay Liberation Movement are just three examples of the significant changes that continued throughout the 1970s. How do you think Americans who maintained traditional values responded to these movements? While many Americans considered all of these changes to be a sign of progress, they were met with resistance from those who felt that society was changing too much and too quickly. By the 80s, these disagreements between the two sides turned into larger political clashes. The culture wars had begun. Now let's delve deeper into the two main sides of the culture wars. Generally, we can define them as conservatives versus progressives. However, not everyone fit into one side or the other, so organizing the many different American values into just two categories can be tricky. But understanding the basic conservative and progressive perspectives can give us a good idea of the two ends of a very wide spectrum of American values and beliefs. First, let's look at the conservatives. When someone says they are conservative, they're usually talking about wanting to maintain traditions and existing ways of doing things. Conservatives aren't entirely resistant to societal changes, but they typically prefer gradual progress rather than abrupt changes. The conservative side of the culture wars refers to people who believe in traditional values and norms, often emphasizing the importance of religion and national pride. During the 1980s, conservatism was often associated with the Christian right, a group of people who want to see Christian beliefs and values reflected in politics. The Christian right was instrumental in helping Ronald Reagan, a key figure in the conservative movement, secure the presidency. In turn, Reagan's leadership helped unify the Christian right movement and establish it as a mainstream force in American politics. Pause here to look at an additional excerpt from Reagan's speech we heard earlier and consider how his ideas match the values of the Christian right. The other side of the culture wars, what we'll call the progressive side, generally embraced change. They valued things like individual rights, diversity and equality, and social justice. Progressives wanted to combat the Christian right's political activism and promote progressive policies. However, in the 1980s, the progressive side was less successful at achieving its political goals. This was partly because the majority of Americans had overwhelmingly chose to support conservative leaders, such as Ronald Reagan. With so many conservatives in office, it was hard for progressive ideas to take hold in government policies. Despite this conservative dominance, progressives made progress in another culture war battlefield: pop culture. MTV, or music television, became a platform for progressive ideas, especially among young Americans. It gave rise to a new generation of musicians who used their music videos to make statements on social and political issues, making them frequent targets for conservative criticism. One example was Bruce Springsteen's song, Born in the USA, which made a political statement against American militarism and critiqued traditional American values. Artists like Springsteen inspired a generation of young Americans to question and reshape their views on politics and the American identity. As we picture the two sides of the culture war, it's not just about who stood for what, but rather what kind of America they dreamed of. Conservatives looked to a past they cherished, while progressives reached for a future they envisioned. So think back to the lesson preview and the values that resonated with you. What kind of America do you dream of? Let's dive into some specific issues that divided Americans during these culture wars. Before we move on, though, it's important to understand that these topics continue to spark significant debate today. It's okay if you don't agree with one side, and even if you don't agree with either side. Our goal is simply to see how the culture wars contributed to these issues. Why is that important? Well, it helps us understand the impact of our own values when forming political opinions. One major topic of debate in the 1980s was the role of religion in public schools. Conservatives, particularly the Christian right, argued for the inclusion of religious activities in schools, like prayer and the teaching of creationism rather than evolution. They believed that schools should uphold traditional values and Christian morals. Let's check back in with President Reagan to hear what he had to say about this issue. Pause to read another excerpt from his speech. While conservatives like Ronald Reagan believed that religious values can play a part in government decisions, progressives advocated for the separation of church and state. Progressives insisted that public schools should not be associated with a specific religion to respect the diverse beliefs of all students. They argued that including religious activities in public education violated the First Amendment's protection of religious freedom. Another pivotal issue in the culture wars was abortion, especially following the Roe v. Wade decision in 1973, which legalized abortion. Conservatives typically opposed abortion, seeing it as immoral and against Christian values. They were generally pro-life, advocating for laws to restrict or prohibit abortion. On the other side, progressives were generally pro-choice. They argued that having the choice to access safe, legal abortions was a fundamental aspect of women's rights. This debate became a central theme in the culture wars. On one side, it showcased conservative values of tradition and religious morality. On the other side, it showcased progressive values of personal autonomy and individual rights. It's a debate that reflected deeper ideological differences and continues to be a significant and complex issue in American society. In both of these issues, Americans couldn't agree on what was right or wrong. Both conservatives and progressives acted on their beliefs, values, and interpretations of what they thought was best for society. Learning about both sides helps us develop empathy and respect for diverse viewpoints, even if we don't agree with them. It also encourages us to think critically about our own values and how they influence our opinions about political and social issues. Pause here to think about what policies or issues facing America today that you would want to either defend or change. In the 1980s, the culture wars were generally described in terms of us versus them, with each side claiming to represent the true American identity and pointing to the other side as a threat. However, as we reflect on these divisions, it becomes evident that there is no correct American identity. America's strength comes from its diversity of thoughts, ideas, and values. Although we may not always agree on everything, our diverse values are what drive us forward, challenge us to grow, and inspire us to build a society where every unique voice contributes to our history. We'll see you next time, historians. Until then, think about how your actions, beliefs, and values contribute to the ever-evolving narrative of what it means to be American. Because remember, it's up to you to make history.